I can feel like getting to that tipping point where people are going to be like starting to fight me, just starting to be like, well, she's too, you know, big for her boots kind of thing.
There's going to be
So
like a Sydney Weekend Book Review article called "The Problem with Alice Allen."
yeah, he's
Uh,
like, could be.
Oh, I did want to say it
It wouldn't
reminds
be
me
hard to
actually.
write it. Sorry, Cameron.
I did want to say it reminds me actually. I don't think I don't think I think I listened to the episode and I don't think I've talked to you since. But I think I just wanted to say that I really liked was it the Antarctica episode?
Oh, thank
I listened
you.
to
yeah,
that. Yeah, no, I thought that was
that's
wonderful.
great. That's a great one.
Thanks, Cameron. That's really sweet.
You've had like
Anyway,
I don't think I've even like texted with you about all of them. You just had like a bunch of really good stuff lately. Like
oh,
I haven't
thanks.
like talked with you individually about each one, but yeah, you've been doing good work.
That's really nice to hear.
Mhm.
The thing I recorded this week is like, I'm taking a break because I feel like everything I'm putting out is shit. So I have no internal compass at the moment. Anyway, let's stop talking about me and talk about Horace.
Last week.
Yes, we have to.
Do you want to pass judgment on my gender essentialism real quick? Because
Oh yeah, what was your gender essentialism again?
oh no, well that's a whole other thing. But yeah, it was just for today. I chaperoned my daughter on a non-date with her boy who is a friend to go see Inside Out 2.
Oh, adorable.
Um, so I like drank coffee at the bar while they went and sat in the movie,
Oh,
and
cute.
I had a brief exchange with a bartender that was like completely intuitive, totally unconsidered, just like immediately off the cuff. And then the second I said it, I
Mm.
thought like, oh, I bet definitely Brian, probably Cameron, and possibly Alice would object to everything I just said.
What did you
But the
say?
female bartender was talking to there are two female bartenders. They were talking. One of them was saying, "Oh, I'm going to get." She said something like, "I'm going to get him either a book or maybe flowers. I don't know what you get a man." And she said, "I think I'm going to get him flowers." And I just, just piped up and said, "No, get him flowers." And then she said, "Yeah, but he's kind of a feminine man." And I said, "Oh, is he gay? Oh, then flowers might be fine." And then she said, "Well, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what to get him that I could send him." And I said, "Oh, I mean, does he drink?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, just send him booze. That's easy. Like whether he's gay, straight, or whatever, just send him booze."
Yeah, just send it, but that seems
Yeah.
simple.
I figured the
I feel like
conclusion
if
would Cameron would approve, but along the way, you would have qualms with everything else I
well, I
said.
feel like if he's gay, you should like.
Cameron, you there?
Oh, he muted himself.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay, I that was all.
Yeah. All right. So tell us
I
what to do
said
if
I
he's
think
gay.
if he's gay, you should send him like a sex toy.
Only gay people have sex. We know this.
You should send him
Yeah, he
his.
was saying like a dildo or something.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah,
I
that's what
actually
I do
think
for my gay friends.
I was the woke one in this. I think like I'm the more progressive one for some
Yeah,
reason.
I think you
Right.
win
No,
this round, Matthew. I think
no,
you're
I don't think
okay.
you ever have to worry about what Cameron thinks anymore. But I'm like, would you not want flowers? Would you not appreciate that as a nice gesture?
Me?
Yeah.
No. I mean, people have given me flowers at times, and I've always taken it to be nice because they're trying to do something nice. But like, I don't want flowers. Why would I want flowers? I don't understand why anyone would want flowers. I just know from evidence that like women seem to like. I'm sure not all women do, but like I have been shocked by how often and how consistently and how intensely the women in my life have liked flowers. So
Hmm.
yeah, I just take it as it's just evidence. That's all I've got.
Yeah, well, I think that definitely could be a socially conditioned thing, but I think flowers bring a room together. Like if you get some nice flowers, you put
But
them in
that's
the
a
center of
rug.
the table.
That's a rug, Elijah.
Well,
Not
no, but
flowers.
it's yeah, it's a variation on that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you put it on top of the table, not beneath the
There you
table.
go. All right. Well, I know what to get you then.
A rug.
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This is going to be, I think, this is going to be a good one. So I spoke with Alice, Cameron, and Elijah from Versecraft, and we had sort of a monster session that ended up having, I think I'm going to break into 3 parts, but they're sort of all different parts. So this one on the main feed is a discussion of Horace's Ars Poetica, which we'll talk about exactly what that is, but it is a piece of writing that he did on the art of poetry. We have some very different opinions about it across the 4 of us, but it was a lot of fun to talk about. Then the other 2 parts, which I think I'm going to put on the Secret Show, are a long and, like, I think strangely, like, very raw and honest conversation about failure and, like, in poetry, and sort of hope and despair and carrying on, and what, you know, what the work means, what your life means. big heavy stuff. I think I'm going to use Cameron's the title which he used in the part of that conversation was Cameron heckling Elijah from the sidelines. Their competition for I don't know, for approval from Alice and me, surely not from somebody, is a running theme in this episode. But he called that part of the conversation Matthew and Alice school Elijah in futility. And I think I might use that as the title. And then third is an even more explicitly competitive conversation in which the 4 of us discussed 2 poems, one by Elijah and one by Cameron, each in imitation of the other person. That is, I think that is a lot of fun, and it is a slightly lighter note to end on. So I'm going to put those other 2 parts up on the Secret Show feed. I might by this point already have one of them up, but they're very much worth checking out. So I hope you will go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and do so. You get a week's access for free if you put your email address in, and after that it's pretty fucking cheap. And again, like, if money is a problem, just write me an email. Write me at sleerickets@gmail.com if you have questions or problems or concerns, or you're like a starving artist and you need a break. Just let me know. There's also one other announcement. The inaugural issue of the New Verse Review is out. It features a lot of SLEERICKETS adjacent people. I do have a poem in there myself. I have not read the whole issue yet, but I think it's a promising magazine. I have some thoughts. I don't know how much I'll air on the show, but it's worth a look. I think it's worth a look. It's all available free online. Congrats to Steve Knepper on getting that published. It was no small feat. And congrats to everybody who's got a piece in it. Ethan, Elijah, Zara. Fuck, too many people. I see. This problem is I start naming people and I forget. A lot of people are in it. A lot of familiar names. Oh yeah, Jennifer Reeser. I mean, Jennifer Reeser is not somebody I've had on the podcast, though I think I might want to now. I read a really good poem of hers the other day. Victoria Moole, who I spoke to recently. Zara has a review and a poem. The review I've not read because it's of my book, but the poem I have, and I liked it. It was not one I knew. I thought it had kind of a deadly little ending. James Matthew Wilson, ever controversial. His poem was like that one I did read, and I thought like that was not terrible. It was not his worst. It feels a little bit. It sort of is making fun of stuck-up Christians a little bit, but it does so in a way that I fear feels a little like a stuck-up Christian making fun of stuck-up Christians. I'm sorry, that's incredibly unkind of me, but James Matthew Wilson, not ever-present name in my life, despite myself. Katie Hartsock, Jenna Lee, not on the podcast yet, Jenna Lee, but I'm hoping to get her on soon, someday. Marion Corbett, woof, yeah, another preview. Cameron and I had a very searing conversation about a Marion Corbett piece. Actually, a Marion Corbett piece that's in this issue. So yeah, that's worth a look. Oh, Amit of course is in here. Amit Majmadar. Michael Angel Martin, who I believe is a listener. Susan Delaney Spear, familiar name. Oh, Am I Divine, which is Michael Divine. Am I Divine, again, is like an A.M. Juster kind of pseudonym. Yeah, just like a lot of good names, a lot of familiar names. Some familiar without being good, some good without being familiar. I think all the familiar ones were also good, if I'm not mistaken. I think I've read, yeah, I think that's right. And if I'm forgetting anybody else or skipping over anybody else, I apologize. But yeah, go check it out, New Verse Review. But for now, please enjoy this conversation that I had with Elijah, Alice, and Cameron about Horace's Ars Poetica. We have talked about Horace a number of times on the podcast before. We have almost always talked about his odes. So he wrote 4 books of odes. They've come up on 3 adjacent podcasts or contiguous I don't know what we are, tangential podcasts.
I like
recently.
contiguous. That's nice.
Podcast mob,
yeah. They've got the odes of Horace have come up a lot recently, but this is one of the epistles of Horace. So he wrote, in addition to his odes, he wrote epodes and epistles, and probably a couple of other things, but that's really mostly all I know. And this is
the Carmina,
Carmina,
I think like the
Carmina Secularum.
Yeah. The
I think
songs.
that's because that's included in my
Oh, does it count as an ode?
in my odes? So I don't know. I don't know if it's counted or not. But it's
Can I just
included
go?
in my edition.
Are the epistles prose? Because you said the thing you sent me was in a prose translation.
So the epistles are written in verse, but they are traditionally translated into prose, I guess, because, or at least this one is. I don't know if the others are. At least the Ars Poetica. So epistle 2-3 from the so the third epistle of the second book, to the Pisos, because it's to a couple of people whose names were some Roman version of that, and it is traditionally known now as the Ars Poetica, the art of poetry, because it is mostly advice or observations about writing poetry and often specifically writing plays. I mean, if we remember in Aristotle's Poetics, he in talking about poetry, he's often talking about what we would think of as playwriting, because these were all the same larger genre in the past. It seems to be the case that at least one of the people he's addressing has ambitions to be a playwright. It's not clear how developed these ambitions are, but Horace gives, it's not a textbook, but it is it's a fairly dense series of observations. And Echo, hold on. You just asked to come in here. I'll let you out in a minute. Hold on. It's pretty conversational. I mean, it is a letter. It is written like a letter. It's a little bit digressive, but it's pretty dense, and it's full of a lot of lines that have become even just part of our everyday language. I'm going to let Elijah take over for a second while I get my stupid dog out of the... Don't ask to come in again if you don't want to stay here. All right.
Yeah, so this has been one of the most seminal texts of Western literature. We get the terms in medias res, meaning in the middle of things, from this poem. We get the term purple prose from this poem. We get the phrase even Homer nods from this poem, meaning that even great poets will have lines that are not so great. I'm sure there's other ones too.
That poem should delight and instruct.
Oh yeah, of course.
And it's the phrasing of that. It's like, I think the phrasing of that is often repeated elsewhere is not exactly his phrasing, but that's his construction at least. And then I would just say, like, a lot of the observations about poetry today, in his day, this was written in the 19 BC, it feels very contemporary to today. And a lot of his advice feels fairly timeless. Taking all that, we can talk about what his specific advice is, but it is it's a very well-known and celebrated guide to poetry. I would say broadly like most very famous guides to poetry or arguments for poetry or defenses of poetry or manuals for poetry, I don't read it as being all exactly correct, but I read it as all being sort of worth hearing out. And we can talk about sort of the different ways one might read it. I do know from our WhatsApp thread that one of us has very, very strong feelings about this. And I feel like we should just
Who
let
could
you,
that be?
we should let you give us your thought for a minute, Cameron.
Oh, I was going to say it's Elijah.
Well, I know,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I think there may be strong feelings, but you have strong criticisms of. I mean, I don't know if
Antipathy.
criticism is even a strong enough term for what you feel toward this, Cameron.
Yeah, I think the way to strategize here is to have you just vent your spleen as much as you want, and then the three of us can respond to you.
Yeah, I think you're going to go
Right.
insane otherwise. We can approach it a few different ways. But yeah, why don't you? I want to
more
let
patient than you think.
some of the pressure off. I want to open a valve for a minute for you.
Well, I just think it's god awful. I didn't know about its existence, but until I think I may have accidentally started this episode off because I think I read an extract from it somewhere, and I think I sent the extract onto maybe Matthew and Elijah or just Matthew and said, what god awful advice. I can't remember the exact extract, so I can't tell you it.
I think you were upset about the mixture of animals together.
I know as soon as I sent you a copy,
came
you
later.
Immediately complained about the very first sentence. So I know
Yes.
that happened.
Yes, so the very first paragraph is hideous. I will say now that I tried to read Horace's Odes when I was a teenager, which is probably too young for sort of the mature wisdom that Horace wants to embody in his odes. And I read them in a selected translation edition, the edition where it has all the different, it selects the best translations of each ode. And I sort of slogged through it without being very bored. And at the time, not at the time, but later on, I chalked this up to just being a child, basically, and not, being mature enough to read them. And most likely this is still the case, considering my age. But I did try and read them again a year or so back and was continuously and horrifically bored. And my pet theory is that Horace is and probably will always be the first and the greatest Hallmark card writer in existence. It seems to me that his verses are kind of wise, like wisdom delivered.
It's like Mary Oliver.
Which I think is basically what Hallmark cards are trying to do. They're trying to deliver wisdom, although most of it's sort of banal, cliched.
It's recognition without surprise, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm not even saying this is a criticism per se. I don't think, I think Hallmark cards are themselves bad, but I'm not saying that Horace is anywhere near as bad as a Hallmark card. Horace.
Well, that does seem to be what you just said, but
well, the person.
But
no, but
feel free to
Horace.
revise.
What I'm saying is that the Hallmark card tradition seems in a great way to descend from Horace's versification.
Okay,
but that's not quite saying that they're the same thing.
Sure, it's sort of like saying like Jesus was the first Grand Inquisitor. Like, well, I don't know if that's quite fair.
I've been told by many people, Rowan Wilson among them, that Horace is extremely elegant and beautiful in Latin, and maybe that's true, but I really have no desire to read him in English that much. Anyway, getting to this, so I think this is god-awful advice all the way through, but I think the first paragraph is just hilariously idiotic. So,
you want to read?
I don't like.
You have. I can't remember which version you have. Christopher Smart, is that it?
Yeah, that's the one you sent me.
Yeah.
So the first sentence is, if a painter should wish to unite a horse's neck to a human head and spread a variety of plumage over the limbs of different animals taken from every part of nature, so that what is a beautiful woman in the upper part terminates ultimately in an ugly fish below, could you, my friend, refrain from laughter were you admitted to such a sight? And my answer is yes, I really fucking could. I would be quite fascinated by this picture, firstly. It seems like a very interesting idea. And I think Horace is trying to make a point that, well, he goes on to say that one cannot mix, different elements together. There's a great focus in Horace about sort of a lack of mixing things together. this seems like a terrible idea for art. I mean, the tragic comic, just to take an example, is a perfect mixture of elements that produces something very unsettling and completely un-Horatian. And this comment is not just stupid, like theoretically, but clearly has nothing to do with the history of art. I mean, if you go and look at Goya or Francis Bacon or Dali or any of the surrealists, you will find many pictures exactly which, like the ones Horace in this ode advises against, as if it was sort of pure common sense that such an idea is ridiculous. And to be honest, I think, and I said in the group chat, this entire Ars Poetica seems to embody a sort of sense that I went to poetry to get away from, a sort of lack of imagination, a sort of common senseness that, to be honest, I think is completely alien to the poetry that I admire and like. And that's why I find this sort of entire Ars Poetica like disgustingly boring and really quite completely lacking in imaginative qualities. But like that's my sort of opening that's my opening spittle fest. You guys can sort of go ahead.
I just want to add like a little bit of context that might help slightly with that, because I totally see how the common sense approach that Horace seems to want poets to take in this piece of writing would rile you, Cameron. But I think the way that I read it is that this is the letter to the Pisos, the family. And the way I read it is basically the head of the family has come to Horace and said, my son wants to become a poet, like wants to write verses like you do. Can you have a word to him? Like, could you just talk to him a little bit about what that's like? And so he's always talking with this super beginner in mind and kind of trying to protect him from doing anything too crazy to start off with. And I think that
he talks over and over again about ridicule, about avoiding ridicule.
Yeah. Like people will laugh at you if you try to do this without knowing what you're doing. And I think that he does start in the middle of things. He starts with the whole like woman up top with the ugly fish below. You're invited to look. How could you possibly manage to keep a straight face? Like that does it. First of all, it seems like a weird place to start, but that's Horace all over. But also later on in this piece of writing, I think he modifies that a little bit and he says, look, if you know your stuff, if you have the tools, then sure, play.
Right. And
but
Horace,
don't just start by doing crazy batshit things like this just because you think it's cool and fun.
Right. And Horace is explicitly not against mixture in general. He says, if I decided to write a satyr play, Pisos, you wouldn't find me confining myself to a low colloquial style. When it was right, you wouldn't find me avoiding a higher tone, as if it didn't make any difference whether Davos was talking to Pythias, etc., etc. So Horace's main thing is you have to know your context. It's not about never mixing things. It's about knowing exactly what's appropriate for a given situation, and that's what he's most.
That seemed to me like way because Cameron, you said that like purity was his central theme, and I really think that's you could see an Ars Poetica that was all about purity begin in a similar way, but I think as Elijah said, like this is really about. I mean, really, what came to mind was the Hamlet speech to the players in Act 3, Scene 2. He says, suit the action to the word to the action. Basically, like you should always look for what is fitting in the moment, what is fitting for this theme or fitting for this context. And I think some of that can read as conventionality. And he does even say, like, start with the conventional, but then he also says, don't be a slave to it. Don't just limp along and just follow the rules and try to be correct all the time. Don't be what would later become the neoclassicists. But I did think about this as being specifically like advice to somebody aspiring to write poetry. And part of what occurred to me here was that some young jackass wants to be a poet, has not studied a lick in his life, and has decided, hey, I can write, because a theme in this a recurring theme in this essay is, and anybody thinks he can just get up and start being a poet. They can just spring from his lips in an inspired breath. and you have to do a lot of work. You have to think about a lot of different things. There's a lot to consider. And so part of what I read this as was a sort of a shock and awe campaign. Like, oh, you want to be a poet? Here's like a fraction of the stuff that you have to know. Here's
want my advice?
A taste of what I have to be thinking about and mastering all the time. Beyond that, though, Cameron, I did have a similar response to yours when it came to some of his pronouncements about morality, when it came to some of his pronouncements about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I did appreciate that even when talking about like making poetry delight and instruct, he makes a point of always referring to the audience's response. That he says, the young will hate it if it's not delightful, and the old will hate it if it's not instructive. That he does always seem to be looking at, well, how do people actually respond to what is done, to what happens when they hear it? That he says it's not enough to be beautiful, it has to be sweet. Meaning it's not enough for it to be abstractly, formally correct. It has to taste good in the mouth. And so I did, like, I think that there's a pretty strong defense for some of these claims he makes early on. A question I had that I don't know if Elijah, you will have more insight into, is there does seem to be, beyond all of that, taking all of that into account, there does seem to be a less decadent or a less sophisticated taste, that there are things we are more ready to take in. There are mixings and there are muddlings and there are sacrileges that we have a better appetite for than they seem to have. And I wonder how much of that is just the shifting of tastes and cultures over time. Like, it does seem to be the case that some of the things that there are things that would be genuinely shocking to them that would not be shocking to us, or that we might even be able to take delight in, that would just be repulsive to them. And I wonder what, I mean, like he makes the point, even in talking about plays, that he says basically, like, don't show scenes of horrible, like, intense sex or violence on stage, because they will either not be believable or they will be overwhelming. Like, people will not be paying attention to the play anymore. They will be paying attention to this spectacle they're watching that is either too disgusting or too lascivious or too whatever. And I think, like, that's something we obviously have a slightly different, we have different conventions about today, given what happens in movies. So I'm curious, like, how much of this is just like cultures change, times change, tastes change.
Yeah, I mean, do you know the anecdote about Aeschylus designing masks for the Furies in the Oresteia, and the masks he designed were so horrifying that it made women supposedly go into labor early or have miscarriages because they were so terrified. Yeah. So I mean, if that can be achieved with a mask, I mean, imagine what you could achieve with butchering somebody on stage. I mean, it seems like even as recently as the 80s, people who went to go see Star Wars movies, I think, like, there were people who would scream, like, when the TIE fighters would come zooming in,
right?
Because they were not used to seeing anything like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a perfect example. Like, that's just a couple generations ago.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking at the minimalism,
one generation ago, I mean, I think, or for me at least,
right? Yeah. And so yeah, I can easily imagine that these many generations back, the sensitivity would have been very, very different as to what you were expecting to see on stage, what you would be comfortable seeing on stage, what you think could even be possible on stage.
And even beyond stage, like poetry, just like even his example of like a show of paintings where you have a bunch of, it's like, as Cameron said, like, oh, I would rather like that. Like, I would much rather see a show that's a bunch of sort of half men, half fish, half whatever other animal, than just a bunch of nice, tasteful nudes. Like, and I think it probably, again, some of that is not quite to Horace's point, but some of that is also probably is that kind of show probably would be a little bit shocking and off-putting in Horace's time.
Well, I'm actually,
or just comical.
I'm a little surprised by it, because in mythology you do have all these different combinations of humans and animals, and those kinds of things. Those kinds of things were depicted. So yeah, I mean, what Horace initially describes as a
like
mermaid,
the sirens, right, or the
right?
giants, yeah.
And so that actually that also gives me pause, not so much because I hate what Horace is saying, but because I'm like, well, was there not? I mean, were there not any depictions of sirens or griffins or mermaids or chimeras or anything like that? So that, I mean,
I
I
think
guess
also of
maybe according to
Dionysus.
the maybe according to the particular painting fads of Horace's day, those kinds of things were not in vogue or not in style, maybe. But what I really want to get to is I think Horace's essential point, which we might pay less attention to now, but which I think is very valid, is he's seeking harmony on two levels. He's seeking harmony with reality, harmony with mimesis, the classical ideal of mimesis. He wants depictions of characters to be convincing. He doesn't want old men to act like young men and young men to act like old men, or a highborn character to speak in a lowborn way. He wants all of this to be convincing to an audience. And secondly, he wants harmony within the work of art itself. He wants everything to be compatible. And this is why I thought of Thomas Aquinas's integritas consonantia and claritas, which translates to integrity, by which Aquinas means that the thing is whole, it's not incomplete. Consonantia meaning that every part of the whole is in harmony with each other, and then claritas being getting the character of that thing intelligible to you because of the harmony of all the parts. And I think Horace is arguing for something similar. I mean, I think he's more attached to realism than we would be now. But I mean that's really just something that changes based on the generation. I mean, the mid 19th century French novelists were very attached to realism in a way that I think is very akin to Horace. And, we might see, and there are plenty of realist novelists now who would not do fantastical things. I mean, we have a lot more pluralism now. We have so much fragmentation and subcultures of people doing different things and having different standards. We have people who like sci-fi and people who like realist stories, and they all have different expectations going in. But I think what remains true across all of those different kinds of expectation is you want the work of art to be convincing within its own world, and convincing based on whatever pre-established standards you have for it. In any story, you want it to not have plot holes. You want it to make sense. You don't want characters who start out a certain way to, in the next scene or in the next chapter, be acting a completely different way. You want that kind of continuity. So I think across the board, we still desire harm, unless you're deliberately going for patent absurdism. You want harmony and consistency across the work of art you're creating, and that's just part of good craftsmanship. And I think that remains true, and that's why a lot of what Horace is saying remains valuable. And whether or not you are a proponent of realism, naturalism, I guess, whether something could actually happen in real life, you still want it to be relatable enough that it is relevant to your life and it can engage you. You want human beings to act like human beings. You want a character to be someone that you think that you could actually have an encounter with in real life, even if that character is an alien or is on another planet or something. So I think we do desire a certain amount of naturalistic realism, always, even if it's on another planet, or even if it's in a fantasy world, or even if it's in a surrealist world. Because even a surrealist world, there's a lot of bizarre things going on, and there might be all kinds of animal human hybrids, but there's still a dream logic to it. And they call it a dream logic. And if something violates that, if there's something that's completely against the aesthetic or completely against the flow of what's happening in a surrealist painting or cartoon or whatever it is, then that's going to be jarring, and it's probably going to be not what you want. There's different kinds of randomness, and if you're accustomed to a certain kind of randomness in a work, even if you treasure that randomness, it doesn't mean you're going to tolerate or be okay with any kind of chaos that could be thrown into a work of art. So I think he's being very conscientious about both appealing to we want to see things that are believable according to the worlds that are presented. And and we want it all to fit together well in a way that is intelligible to us, in a way that makes sense, and where what's being communicated is clear.
There's you brought up realism and naturalism a couple of times, and this is like probably a topic for another day, but it has been something I have gotten snagged on a number of times in the past, that when we say realism, or not realistic, what we usually seem to be talking about are the larger rules of the universe. Like you can have dragons and angels, you know, flapping around with humans, but even, you know, but like then humans are speaking in normal conversations in normal ways and being true to human character, and we call that not realism. Whereas to me it feels like, well, that's pretty much realism. It's just with angels and dragons added. And
Yeah,
then then there's like realism in the sense of, well, there's no plot because plot itself is an artifice. And then there's another kind of like, you know, non-real. And then there's another kind of non-realism that is the one I tended to find the most off-putting, which is like the Ionesco realism, a non-realism, which is that human beings don't act in a way that we recognize as being like human beings, where they squawk and they say, you know, language from advertisements, and they don't, you know, they sort of, they move robotically. They don't operate in a way that we would say is familiar to, like, oh, I recognize that as a kind of person I've seen before. Now, I think like he and Beckett and even somebody like Yorgos Lanthimos would probably say, like, in acting in a stilted way that we don't immediately recognize as realistic, there is a deeper realism. But that, like, that I would say, like, that's something I very much appreciate Horace for doing in here, which is saying, like, go listen to people, go watch people, see what people are like and what they're like at different ages, and then be true to that. I mean, again, like I thought of Hamlet, hold a mirror up to nature, and then think about the audience's response. So again, it's not so much fidelity to some objective set of laws as it is fidelity to the audience, to your own observation of life, and to the occasion, whether that's the occasion that is provided for you or that's the occasion created by the work you're in the middle of.
How are you doing, Cameron? This has been a shock and awe campaign on you so far.
I like what you say, Matthew, about realism. Although I would like to say, in defense of Ionesco and Beckett, I mean, I know many people, or at least I've met some people who seem to me very robotic and talk in advertising jargon. But I guess that's
no. But I mean, Beckett's treatment of that, I find Beckett's treatment and Lanthimos' treatment, I find fundamentally convincing. Ionesco's treatment, I find to be deeply cynical. Like, I think Ionesco didn't listen to people and think, oh God, there is something I want to capture there. I think he listened to people and thought, swine, you know, and then decided to capture that.
I agree there's contempt in Ionesco.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
With Beckett, I find it like deeply compassionate, even when it's weirdly robotic or anti-realistic.
Well, I feel like I read Beckett as a sort of someone possessed of a deep love. I read Ionesco as sort of horror fiction. It like deeply unsettles me. And I think part of that is the contempt as well as the characters themselves. Look, I don't really believe in realism. Not that I reject realism, but I just think all art is fantasy, and it just seems to me that realism is very arbitrary.
Well, but again, that's not what Horace advocates. He's talking about. He says, go listen to people, go watch people, go pay attention to life.
Well, I wasn't talking about Horace. As to that, I think that's the thing in Horace I agree with the most, where he says go and observe people. I can get on board with that bits. Sorry, Elijah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to clarify the distinction between realism and naturalism. I think it's useful, especially for a conversation like this. I think there is a catholicity to realism that is not found in naturalism. Realism is about, is this thing, regardless of what the situation is, does it have relevance to real human life? And that's the important thing. And I think that is found in most good art. I think that good art of all sorts requires that. It requires to be a commentary on how human life is lived. It's going to be relevant to us. If it's going to be valuable to us. Naturalism is about, is this like the thing that's on the street right now? Or is this like the thing that was on the street a couple hundred years ago? It's about that kind of facticity. And that kind of almost journalistic attention to detail. And I think that can be very limiting. I think you can get good art out of it, but it's just one preference among many. And I don't think Horace goes that far, but his realism is a kind of naturalistic realism, which is not always preferred now. I think we do have more tolerance we have a more expanded and more generous view of realism than he does. I think for him, people need to be convincing in a certain way that was particularly relevant to the Roman population at his time. Like, there needs to be highborn characters and lowborn characters. They need to act how highborn and lowborn characters act in real life. Old people need to act like the old people that Horace knows. and young people like the one according to the social mores of what he's used to. So I think that is something that people might push back against. And I think that is maybe a limitation in something in some of what Horace is saying, because we do have an expanded view of what realism is. But I think realism in general,
the larger observation about like classes and ages and like the larger observation there, I read not as, we'll make sure low-born people speak in a low-born way and high-born people speak in a high-born way, because he also, all of this is riddled with exceptions. The larger observation I read was, hey, notice that people talk in different ways. Like, go notice that not everybody talks like your buddies in your college dorm, and that different people have different ways of speaking, and be attentive to that when you are writing. I think he may also have had more conventional tastes, but I read it as chiefly like, hey, there's a lot of stuff you have to think about if you're going to write dialogue. And part of it is different people speaking in different ways depending on their conditions. Then in addition to that, he says like maintain those divisions consistently. But I read it mostly as like, hey, young kid, you can't just write everybody as a sarcastic 20-year-old.
Yeah, I mean,
don't be Aaron
that's
Sorkin.
definitely true also.
Yeah, not everybody can be Aaron Sorkin.
Yeah. He also is quite worried, I think, about, and when I was reading this again this morning, I thought you could almost read this as a classist thing, and maybe that's a little bit of what irks you, Cameron. He's a bit worried about the fact that audiences in the time that he's writing have changed from maybe when he started, and all of a sudden there are all these people who used to just be out on the farms, like not coming into the city. They're in the theaters, they're watching stuff, and they don't have the same kind of expectations, they don't have the same kind of patience. And he's like, yeah, and now, the flute solo sounds ridiculous because it's just trying to make itself heard over all these people yelling and commenting. And he sounds a little bit like, oh, this riffraff is coming into the theaters now and it's ruining art. But I thought that's an important moment too, because he's saying, okay, so that is happening. So don't get completely distracted by that. Do not pander to that. Keep your craft in mind. You need to learn the tools of the trade and then go and do this. But don't just try to please people, particularly these new people who are now in the theater.
Which is another exception, right? Like it's another moment of saying,
it's
hey,
another
pay
exception.
attention to the audience. Oh, but don't just
Yeah.
throw chum to the groundlings. And speaking
Exactly.
of which, like that is like that whole gripe is another passage that is effectively echoed in Hamlet's speech, saying like, hey, all of the only popular shows right now are like shows where a bunch of little kids play grown-ups. And it's like, it's the stupidest shit I've ever seen, but like that's what sells out. That's what sells out theaters in London. So we had to go on the road.
We had to do it. Cameron, let me read you this little bit that I think you might actually like. Or it sounded almost like it could have been you.
Is it the bit about coining new words?
Oh, no. Yeah, because he's in favor of neologisms.
Yeah, he's in favor of them with qualifications. But it's the bit where he says, I've got the David Ferry translation. Sheer abstract beauty isn't enough in a poem. Its language must so persuade the listener and act upon his soul that he'll respond as the poem intends. Men smile if the language smiles. They weep if the language weeps. And that just sounded a little bit like you, Cameron. I don't know. What do you reckon?
Well, that's very kind. I mean, I thought it sounded a lot like Matthew. But okay. I don't disagree with that at all. It's not like I think every single statement in this Ars Poetica is wrong, and I think there's a lot of true things and a lot of obvious things. It's just I find the general. It's interesting because when I hear you and Matthew Alice talk about it, you often talk about how you seem very interested in sort of the personae of the piece. You're talking about how he's writing this sort of letter to like an asshole who thinks he can write when he can't, whatever. Which I think is all true, and so. But I guess I just don't. The writing itself doesn't interest me enough for me to sort of spend time trying to work out or trying to imagine a kind of context to it. And I guess another thing for me, there's sort of a lot of sort of discussions. The entire thing actually reminds me of what I find sort of most abhorrent in Shakespeare criticism. When people like, if you take the scene in Macbeth, the porter scene, right? You'll find a lot of people commenting about how this scene is terrible because it's a porter making a series of dick jokes right over the death of a king and sort of the complete dramatic mismatch of these two completely tonally juxtaposed scenes. I think the Porter scene is one of the best scenes I've ever read, and I think it's wonderful. Firstly, it's like wonderfully reflective of what's come before. Most of the things that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have just discussed reoccur subtly in the Porter's dialogue, which I think is why I don't think I disagree. I think it's with Coleridge who says it probably wasn't written by Shakespeare. I think it definitely almost certainly was written by Shakespeare, but that's neither here nor there and slightly irrelevant. But it seems to me that it's that complete mismatch, that shift in the play, that is sort of the genius quality of it. And it seems to me, and I'm not saying that Horace may well appreciate that specific instance if he was shown it, but it seems to me that this kind of, the whole Ars Poetica does remind me of much of the Shakespeare criticism that disavows and attempts to attack this mismatch in Macbeth.
That sounds like more of a beef you would have with me, Cameron, than with Horace.
I did just because I have a lot of marginalia here, but Alice, the first sentence that you read, sheer abstract beauty isn't enough in a poem. Its semicolon, its language must so persuade the listener and act upon his soul that he'll respond as the poem intends. That sentence you read, my note next to that sentence is advice to both Elijah and Cameron. I think like both of you are sometimes at risk of thinking that like your sense of what is perfectly true or beautiful or good in a poem can sometimes get a little bit far afield from what is the audience's actual response.
Yeah, I'm so often afraid
the patriarch
of
addresses his children.
yeah, why not? Why not? I mean, well, and that is something I think like because I actually thought of you, Cameron, with when he's talking about not mixing tragedy and comedy, though again he does like throughout he keeps saying like, well, but except there's some exception, but also there's this time when, so like part of the moral of the story for me was like there are always exceptions, you have to know when to do it, and you just, and there are many different ways to, there are as many different ways to get it wrong as there are to write a line, but then it did to me, I don't take this as a set of good advice about how to write poetry. I take this as a deeply true monologue in the voice of somebody who is a hardworking and often frustrated poet.
Yeah, the frustrated thing is the important thing there too. But he's just like, no one is listening to me anyway. Like towards the end, he says, what a fool I am for purging myself of bile each year as soon as spring comes around again. Nobody would write better poems than I if I didn't do so. But what on earth's the point? Which is my Kendrick Lamar moment. Kendrick, it's like, fuck the big three. It's just me. But who cares? No one's listening.
I actually wanted to ask you all about what comes immediately after that. Because it seems to me, because that what a fool I am for purging myself of bile each year as soon as spring comes around again, referring to like the in ancient medicine, the idea that bile and blood and phlegm were all humors, and it was the balance of these things in your body that preserved your sanity. And so if you allowed more bile to build up, then you would basically become insane. And it's immediately before that he has this long passage about how like, oh, I guess you should just wandering around like a crazy guy is how to be a poet. I have like my note next to that for you, Elijah, is romantic heroism. But then immediately after that little sort of sarcastic note when Horace says, but what's the point? He writes something, and I wasn't sure how much irony to take this. He says, instead, I'll choose to be a kind of whetstone, good for sharpening steel to a cutting edge, but itself unable to cut. Though I write nothing, I'll teach what it is to write, what fosters a poet and makes him what he is, what's right, what's wrong, what paths he ought or ought not to set out on. Part of me wondered if that was just like, universal poetic self-deprecation. And then part of me wondered if this was not like, what it made me imagine was a letter that inspired this letter that was like, hey, my nephew really wants to be a poet. He hasn't read any of your work, but he thought you would be a really good source for some advice on poetry. And then Horace is like, oh, great, sure. Why would you read my poetry? Fuck my poetry. But yes, I would be happy to sharpen your blade, young master.
It's probably that. It's either that or it's a moment of, because Horace is really changeable all the time. So maybe that's a moment where he it's a moment of total giving up. Like, nobody reads me, nobody will read me, none of this matters. I guess I'll just teach the kids.
I
Can you
always
imagine
teach.
You can always
Can you
teach.
imagine like a particularly disillusioned MFA professor saying this?
Yeah.
I think that Horace is all. I think there's a lot of irony in Horace. I think that he ultimately is pretty confident in his abilities, and so I think that this is ironic. I mean, there may be extenuating circumstances which make him frustrated, certainly, and I think he can be sassy also. But I think that he knows that he's good, and so I think that this is he's operating from a place of ultimate security, I think, in saying this kind of thing. The other thing I wanted to point out, just in the course of this,
like, if that's the case, that also then informs how we should read this whole letter to this particular audience, because that tells us something about how he is speaking to this audience, right? If he like, it would be a little like if he were writing this to a serious poet that he respected, that he was friends with, he wouldn't use that much intense irony. He might make a funny joke about his own failures as a poet, but that particular kind of irony, to me, frames the whole essay.
Yeah, and you can definitely speculate about that. I don't know what all the circumstances were, but what I wanted to point out was that the direction this discussion has taken, I think, shows why you and Alice prefer Horace and Cameron doesn't. And I have sort of mixed feelings because I like a lot of what he's saying, but I don't have the same attachment to his personality that the two of you do. And you're reading this treatise, this Ars Poetica, as a lyric. I think that's how the two of you are most attracted to it.
Yes.
Is like finding out what Horace is expressing of himself in this. And yeah, that's not my main concern when reading this. My main, like, I didn't have the time, but I thought before doing this, I was like, oh, maybe I should make like a diagram of like what he's saying here. And of course, I agree that this is not a piece of philosophy. This is mainly this is like a how to succeed in theater tract. It's not actually giving a philosophy of aesthetics, except in glimpses. But
it's sort of like, I actually did make a diagram of it when I did an episode about this. I did like Horace's rules, and I came up with 21 like things to do.
No, you did. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying you definitely could do that. I'm just saying I think that ultimately it is there. You can definitely see that he believes a lot of this stuff, but he's writing with the aim of saying, this is how you do well. This is how they won't laugh at you. And that's like the main goal, is to, you should follow these precepts so that, you won't be made a laughing stock, and so that you might possibly succeed. And I think that a lot of it is rooted in what he really believes about what one should do in all cases universally. But I don't think this is saying, oh, to make the ideal poem regardless of audience, this is what you should do.
Yeah, and like it's interesting because to affirm this sort of fun narrative of like the separation between the two pairs of us, I do think it's interesting that you and Matthew Matthew and you and Alice, whoever I want to address, the both of you do read it like a dramatic monologue, and I think me and Elijah probably don't read it in that way for different reasons. Me, because I just don't find it interesting enough to invest time into reading it as a dramatic monologue. But it does seem to me that you two do spend a lot of time sort of thinking about the context behind it, and I just don't particularly find that. I don't like, it's interesting, but it's ideationally and abstractly interesting, and it doesn't for me make the actual work ultimately more interesting in this case.
There's an important distinction I want to make, though, because I am interested in the context of the essay, of the letter, but I am far less, like, first, I at least if I take Ferry at his word, we don't really know much about the people. We know very little about the context historically. But what interests me is not so much the like additional facts that could be gathered about his letter writing here. What I'm much more interested in is the context that is implied by the voice of the letter itself. Like that to me is part of the richness of it. Like those little inconsistencies, those little moments of like either self-flagellation or sarcasm showing through, even the moments where he's like, oh, also, yeah, there's a bunch of theater history stuff, like there's Thespis and then Aeschylus and some other guys. Anyway, like to me, like so much of it reads as like, you fucking little shit. All right, like yeah, what I don't know, what do I have on my desk right now? Yeah, oh yeah, probably want to need to know this too. Yep, no, she's great, but like these guys are all shit. Who else? What do we got? I mean, like to me, that's how so much of it reads, and I have so much fondness for that character that I mean, there are very few like guides to poetry where I want to go in and say, I mean, first of all, like at this point, we've just osmotically absorbed so many of these observations, but like there are very few where I feel like I would want to go in and study as a student, like, oh, what is this rule? What is this truth? What do I need to put down in my notebook? I mean, to me, it's much more rich and interesting as a dramatic monologue. And as a, like the other thing is, I think it is a model. This is like Jonathan Farmer's theory of teaching, which is like this is a legitimate set of concerns and attitudes to have about poetry. Not that this is the only one, not that this is the correct one, but like if you want to know what it sounds like when an honest to God, real fucking deal poet chews over and worries about poetry, it sounds like this. It might also sound like plenty of other things, but like this is a legitimate example of that. And there are probably some other monologues, some other ars poeticae that would not actually be, that would be much more bullshitty than this one. So like that's partly what I read this as, like a plausible model of a poet.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was getting at, is that it's about the character, it's about the voice.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Horace relies on, is his charm.
Mm-hmm.
And you are either charmed by Horace or you're not.
Yeah.
And it could, because his ideas are very commonplace.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's that's where my stumbling block is, because I'm interested in ideas, and I want the ideas to be insightful in a way that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of. It doesn't have to be a surprise the way Frost, thinks all poems should surprise, but it needs to be creative and say something that is complex and interesting and profound. And I think that what Horace says is the same thing that all the ancient Greek lyric poets have been saying forever, and that many, many poets have been saying after him. And so if you are going to love Horace, it's going to be because you love him as a person, or your vision of him based on his poetry.
Yeah, no, and I can't,
maybe like
I can't
with the slight distinction that like there's like the him that is the figure implied by the poems versus the history. Like again, like I've read a little bit about his bio and it's kind of interesting, but like that's not what I that's not what I'm
interested by the eye.
You're talking, the lyric eye.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Cameron, what were you saying?
He's too far gone.
I was just gonna offer an invective about how I can't stand charm in poetry. And
you can't stand charm?
I said charm.
Can't stand
charm.
No. What does that mean? What does that mean? What are you talking about?
I think you find Emily Dickinson very charming.
No, I don't find Emily Dickinson charming. I think you want to fuck Emily
Dickinson. I think that's the truth.
No,
she's not charming.
What would that be like?
Well, there's a very creepy Billy Collins poem about it.
Oh God, she said, "Oh no."
It's a terrible poem. Like, why do you write that?
I kind of want you to write that poem now, Cameron. Write a good version of that poem. Yeah, fucking Emily Dickinson.
Fucking Emily Dickinson.
No, I think you do
grabbed by the throat by Emily Dickinson, but I'm not charmed. I'm not. Like,
I think you are. No, because you fawn over her letters. You talk about how much you think she's fascinating as a person. Yeah, but that's a way of being charmed. It's not the same way that Horace would charm, but it's a way. I think that you are very attracted to her as a person, just like you're attracted to Clarice Lispector for being a witch. Like it's the same kind of thing.
For tormenting her interviewers.
Is I guess if you want to extend the word, then it's a kind of charm. But I think.
Well, what do you mean when you say
what do you mean by it?
What is the thing you don't care about or don't like in poetry?
Okay, well, if you take if someone says this poem is very charming, right? That's not quite the same way that you would say I'm charmed by Emily Dickinson, right? That if one says this poem is very charming, what one is talking about is it's very one of the qualities that you would associate with that. It's sort of elegant, it's friendly, cordial, it's sort of I don't know, seductive is a different thing, because I think you can say sometimes I think one can have a very seductive voice and one can have a very charming voice, but they're not exactly the same things. I
Yeah,
guess
well,
I
maybe
don't.
what you don't want is seduction, though. It sounds like you don't want. It sounds like you don't want somebody to get one over on you.
No, I don't mind being seduced. I think it's more that I don't want to be sort of wryly and elegantly given sort of commonplaces. I find Auden, if you go to Auden's poetry, there's a lot of his later stuff that seems to me very charming. It rhymes very sort of melodiously and melodically, and it says things very elegantly. And I just can't stand it because of that reason. It's that type of charm, a kind of melodious elegance that sort of doesn't ruffle you.
Elegance is funny because I mean, for me, elegance is the beauty of doing much with little. And to me, like, I don't know if I don't necessarily associate that with charm, although it certainly can coincide with it. Part of what I hear you saying, Cameron, is that you don't find charm charming.
Yes.
Like the
Yeah,
things that you
that's good.
There's a thing other people call charm or charming that you find boring or irritating.
Yeah, because I really do want to be seduced, Alice. I really don't mind being seduced whatsoever. But I don't want to be charmed, and I think there's a two different things.
Well, you don't want to be charmed the way that most people.
Yeah, I don't want to be charmed
say,
in the typical meaning of charm. Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you're like somebody watching a snake charmer, and you're like, stupid fucking snake. Why is that snake so charmed with its stupid flute? What a gullible piece of shit.
Yeah, the gullibility, the dishonesty that's built into charming someone is a turn off for you. Or
actually, this might be, I don't know if we have enough time, but this might be worth do you guys know the poem There's Something Batters by Auden? They're stranger batters, that's me.
There's stranger batters. No.
That's not the title he gave the Stars poem, is it?
No,
because he gave some of these poems he gave them titles later.
Don't have language. Let me find it and give you the titles so you guys can find it.
They're lonely betters.
Yes, that's it. They're lonely betters. I hate that poem. I find that poem horrible.
Do you have
it's only 16 lines long.
Yeah. Do you want to read it out, Alice?
Yeah, I can quickly read it.
Yeah, please.
They're lonely betters. As I listened from a beach chair in the shade to all the noises that my garden made, it seemed to me only proper that words should be withheld from vegetables and birds. A robin with no Christian name ran through the robin anthem, which was all it knew, and rustling flowers for some third party waited to say which pairs, if any, should get mated. Not one of them was capable of lying. There was not one which knew that it was dying. Sorry, it sounds like Nine Inch Nails. Or could have, with a rhythm or a rhyme, assumed responsibility for time. Let them leave language to their lonely betters, who count some days and long for certain letters. We too make noises when we laugh or weep. Words are for those with promises to keep. Yeah, I mean, that's not going to work for you, is it, Cameron? That is not yours. That's not your bag.
No, I find that pretty insipid also.
That's like
you guys
cute. That's not.
Yeah.
I don't find that charming. I get what he's after, and there are things I like. Let me put it this way: if I found that in a book of children's verse, that would be one of the ones I would pull out to read my daughters, because there's so much garbage in there that I'm like, well, this at least sounds good. This at least has a little art to it. But yeah, that's not like there's a reason I have read that poem and vaguely recognized that title and then immediately forgot it. That there's nothing. That's just not a very good poem.
Yeah, but I see what you mean about Auden though, Cameron, because I feel similarly. I find him very uncharming in the way he tries to charm a lot of the time.
Even that that funeral one, that I find insipid.
Well, that was meant to be a joke. It was meant to be a joke.
We've already covered that.
Yeah, we've gone into funeral blues before.
Yeah. Maybe part of the problem with Auden too is like he's just too famous by the time he gets into that mode that you dislike, Cameron, that he's unable to be genuine anymore.
He does have the Roman Empire one and Musée des Beaux-Arts.
He has a lot of really, really good poems. He also has a lot of maybe part of it is that when he is bad in a cute, charming way. And that's a particular kind of badness. Like that quality is left over even when there's nothing else. It's sort of like It's like when you have like a bucket of fried chicken and then you just have like a chunk of just fry. It's just like just batter. There's no chicken inside. It's just like a chunk of fried batter that fell off
A
on the
chunk
side.
of fry.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love that. That's kind of,
Yeah,
I like
yeah.
that.
Good
Yeah,
title.
It's
but
quite
like
nice.
whatever quality the poet has, they're
Quite tasty.
every poet can be bad, but you've got your Jonathan has that wonderful line about like you've got to decide which kind of badness is going to be your badness. I'm reminded of by your complaint, Cameron, of the in the box ticking list of the qualities of psychopathy. One of the big ones is superficial charm, which is a phrase I've always found sort of annoying because to me it reads as like, well, a psychopath is charming, but underneath that, he's a psychopath. I'd be like, well, hold on a minute. Like maybe it should just be charm. Maybe he's just charming, but then also there's nothing underneath it because that's like sort of like he does like that is, many psychopaths are able to beguile people initially for about the length and for about the depth that people can charm people without having anything underneath. It's not the charm that's superficial. It's the personality that's superficial. But yeah, I think I take your point. I wonder if there is if charm is it's sort of like when people say, this is too sickly sweet. And you're like, oh, instead of being the right amount of sickly sweet, like if charm is the word we have for when a certain quality does work on us, what is that quality without the working on us? Right? Like just identified in neutral terms, and then we can sometimes it's cloying or irritating, and sometimes it's charming, but charm includes that it's working on you, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a good point. I'm trying to think if there is a word because people often say attempt at charm. Yeah, there's not. I don't know if there's a good word for it.
But I'll also say in defense of Horace that what I like about him, what I find charming about him is not that he's very witty and well spoken and comes up with nice little bon mot. He does do that, and that is one of his virtues, but that's not what I find sympathetic and winning the character that seems to be underneath that. It's in the same way that like with Amy Hempel, like her ditzy bubbly patter is not in itself enough to win me over. It's the like deeply concealed pain underneath it that then makes that bubbly patter so touching.
Well, that's slightly relevant to a thing I want to bring up, and I'm going to skip past slightly who with the fact that I have no idea who Amy Hempel is. But okay. But I did want to ask, if I have to read Horace, I will note that I prefer Horace.
You're now done with school. You no longer have to read Horace.
Yeah, you're fine. You're okay.
Not that we ever did read Horace. But
except that I made you read Horace today.
Yeah.
I mean, Cameron, I did. I had a conversation with Matthew about a poem of Horace's back in February that I thought was atypical of him, which is where he's sort of indulging his Dionysian side, and he talks about being a bacchant and running around in the mountains, and I was reading it in Chris Childers' book, and it stood out to me as being a place where Horace is showing another side of himself that I think that you might enjoy, and I actually did a semi-translation of it that I can send to you if you want.
Oh yeah, send it definitely. Yeah, actually, because that's why I wanted to talk about translation. If I have to read Horace, I can't stand Horace in rhyming couplets. I know a lot of people do this because obviously the archaic that Horace wrote in back then was sort of their equivalent of something traditional that we might equivocate as the rhyming couplet now. But I find the rhyming couplet really pushes out Horace's kind of punchy moralizing, or at least messaging, that in a sort of more free-flowing, closer to sort of an archaic form is a lot less pronounced. And I wondered, because I know Matthew admires admires Ryan's translations of Horace, which I think are mostly in couplets. And I know Alice admires David Ferry's translations, which are mostly not. But I wonder if you guys had any sort of thoughts on this. And obviously Elijah has been translating a great many things. So I'm sure you'll all have some intelligent thing to say about something I just said.
You should read Dryden's essay about dramatic poetry, because even though it's about dramatic poetry, he talks about why, and he's talking in the late 17th century when the heroic couplet really starts taking over. He talks about why he uses the heroic couplet to approximate the effect that the Roman poetry would have had, even though Roman poetry does not rhyme. So it's been years since I've read it, but you should look it up, and it's public domain, so you'll be able to find it easily.
Just briefly, I think Ryan's, if memory serves, his 111 is in rhyming couplets, but that's also a very short ode, and it's an ode in which there's a lot of like that's the life is too short for long hopes, like cut, that's using the imagery of a vine, trimming the vine to suit its setting, and measure things out, and pluck the day. That I think he's using rhyming couplets there with an eye to the theme, but generally Horace wrote in stanzas, most of which were not couplets. And I mean, at least my general recollection is
he
that
wrote in Alcaics, right, which is a stanza of 4 lines.
He wrote in a number of different stanzas, but he wrote like part of what we identify as the ode, like insofar as Horace helped to define a type of ode. One of the qualities of the Horatian ode is that it's in stanzas, and a lot of people I know seem to translate him either into I can't remember what the actual correct pronunciation is now that we fucked it up so many times with the Stychic poem. They often are translated them into Styches or sticks, whatever, Stykes, or into stanzas. So I don't know that. I mean, like, I agree. Like, I don't know that rhyming couplets. I don't know that would be especially suitable to him, but I also don't know how common it is. But Alice, you have thoughts about fairy or other translations? Because you also introduced me to the raffle, right?
Yeah, yeah. You could try to get some Burton raffle, Cameron. But I would just say, like, with this piece that we've been talking about, the Ars Poetica, I tried to read it maybe 6 times in the translation that's on the Poetry Foundation's website, and I could never get more than, like, I don't know, a paragraph in. And then I read David Ferry's, and it was just like, it was a completely different piece of writing. So give him a go, give David Ferry a go, but also don't worry, like, maybe this might not be your, you don't have to like Horace.
You need like a Ted Hughes Horace. someone who's going to make the language really strange.
Well, I feel like this is a good question for Elijah, because I don't particularly find most Latin Roman poetry particularly of interest, but I'm very, very, very drawn to the Greeks. And I know Elijah is, maybe for slightly different reasons, but I wonder, Elijah, if you wanted, like, if you have any thoughts about sort of the difference between the Greeks and the Romans that seems to be very present in sort of their verse.
Well, the Romans are living in a much more urbane bourgeois society than the Greeks were. I think that's part of it. There's an urbanity to the verse, a sense of living in a complex, sophisticated civilization and society that I think is absent from the Greek. I mean, the Greeks took a lot of pride in their civilization and society also, but it was a smaller, more tribal. It was a more chaotic milieu to live in, and I think that plays a part. Also, I mean, just the Roman culture, the character of Roman culture is a bit different, I think. And I'm not a classicist, so I can't offer any authoritative pronouncements on this. But the Romans are not seafarers by inclination, whereas the Greeks are. The Greeks are very exploratory people. They loved setting up colonies and going out in all kinds of weather and exploring. Where the Romans had fleets, but they had them basically because they had to. They much preferred to stay on their farms, and they had farms. Whereas in Greece, a lot of the terrain is so rocky and rugged that you can't there isn't a lot of good farmland. I mean, you can have goats, but you can't really have these acres and acres of land the way that Virgil waxes about in the Eclogues and the Georgics. So there's a rootedness and a coziness to the Roman temper, which I think is foreign to the Greek. I think the Greeks are a lot more restless. There's a less of a sense of routine with the Greeks, I think. There is a wildness. I think that, there were certainly mystery religions in Rome, but they were more codified. There was more of a bureaucracy surrounding them. Whereas in the Greek city-states, there would be periods where, everyone in a town or everyone in a city would go out into the wilderness and like tramp through, to the caves and, eat a bunch of bad barley and hallucinate their brains out in these caves and then come back and live life having gone through that kind of thing. It's admirable the way that they're dedicated to balance, and balance doesn't always mean moderation. They have this dedication to rationality and to the sciences and to the arts and history and categorizing things and building orderly things. But then there's also a side to the Greeks, and there's a famous book by E.R. Dodds called "The Greeks and the Irrational." They had this other side to them, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, which is very true to how they were. So they were comfortable with a degree of chaos and a degree of uninhibitedness that the Romans maybe weren't, or that the Romans expressed via decadence, and the Greeks didn't have the resources or the riches to express in decadence, and so they went out and I don't think the Maenads ever actually tore living creatures apart, but those are the legends, and I think that those legends exist for a reason to inspire us with the spirit of what those kinds of things must have been. They were able to tap into craziness sometimes, and I think it's really cool the way that they had that, but they didn't glamorize it more than what its place should have been. It was very compartmentalized. Like there was a time to be crazy and there was a time not to be crazy.
Like what I'm getting from is if like me and you hung out, we'd create Greece. We'd create ancient Greece. Like if we can like combine.
You'd go sack a nearby village.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I feel a lot of kinship with the Greeks because I do have this drive toward order and sanity and rationality in my daily life, but I also I set aside periods where I will, allow myself to let go and really.
But that's also order, right? Like you've got a designated time where you're like, now I'm going to take drugs.
Exactly. And I'm saying that's like this is the balance. Like it's all encompassed in balance. And true balance, this is what the neoclassicists got wrong. True balance needs that. In order to remain sane, you need these periods where you of catharsis, where you go wild and you encounter the god. You meet Dionysus, you meet fear. All of that is necessary, and then that informs the preciousness of order. That informs the preciousness of rationality in most of life. But you need those periods. You need those seeds of irrationality and inspiration to not to write poetry. I'm not going to go down that romantic track, but you need that in your mind. You need to know what that's like in order to, I think, have the most all-encompassing view of the world and the human condition.
If only I could choose.
Exactly. That's the thing. Like if you can choose, yeah, like what if you're meeting fear every moment of every day? You don't get to choose. Like he's there all the time. Then yes, it's a lovely idea.
Yeah, and it may be that if you're someone who is craving more security in your life, you might like the Romans better. Because they have more. There's more of a thoroughgoing calmness to them, and yeah, if you are seeking some wildness and some adventure, then the Greeks might appeal to you more.
I would like to add that I think the Greeks. I think this is true. I don't really disagree with anything you've said, but I think the Romans, for being more urban, seem a lot less like the writers of modernity than the Greeks do.
Or being more urban.
Writers of modernity have more actively pursued novelty, wildness, and
chaos. I think more that. Well, I mean that's a slightly cynical view. I think I would say that the writers of modernity seem more of a kind of savage terror in the urban itself. Wow,
like following the legacy of Baudelaire, basically.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, from Baudelaire to Eliot, to Dickinson to the Spectre, it seems to me that they are much more in line with the writer of the Eurystyle, the Bacchae, than they are with Horace or Ovid. Maybe less so Ovid. Ovid is the Metamorphosis I do like. I'll allow the Metamorphosis.
Yeah, I think Ovid has some I think Ovid definitely has some Baudelairian characteristics.
No, no.
But
do you say Ovid? Oh, okay.
I say Ovid, but yeah, I mean it's anglicized. But yeah, I also think it might have to do something with the stratification of society. I think Baudelaire was very much in the muck all the time, whereas these Romans were the Roman poets were largely coming from at least a semi-aristocratic gentry, and they were in kind of their own world, hanging out with each other and going to each other's parties and events, and then they certainly would have seen the hoi polloi, the plebs, but they weren't, I don't think, interacting with them as intimately as someone like Baudelaire was. And Bohemia did not exist in the same way as it did in Baudelaire's day.
But it's not just about class. I mean, there's just not that kind of savage perception of terror in sort of those poets. I mean, there is terror, but not in the same way that there is for Eliot.
You have to remember that Horace in a way, Horace shares a lot of characteristics with someone like Frost. And when you think of the fact that
that's true.
They lived in very similar conditions. They were both gentlemen farmers. Horace is spending most of his time in the countryside, but he's still urbane in the sense that he's informed by civilization and he has the backing of civilization. And he, he gets to enjoy all the fruits of civilization. Yeah, whereas if you are part of a class of, first of all, I mean, industrial society is different than than Roman society. I think industrial society gets a lot, the cityscape gets even bleaker and more chaotic with that. But also, I mean, by the time you get to the 19th century, artists have become, in many cases, outcasts. They're not, they don't have patrons. They don't have a Maecenas the way that Horace and Virgil did. They're not part of the upper crust, talking, having chats with Augustus and getting all of this funding and all that stuff. They're hiding out in garrets and, meeting in coffee shops and often going hungry. And they feel rejected by society because the society has undergone this bourgeoisification. And, what is, the art that gets produced is the art that caters to the bourgeois, which Horace is already worried about. But I think he's a little bit more, but he's a little bit removed from that. Whereas by the time you get to some of these artists in the 19th century, 20th century, it's really, it's hard to, there's a sense of impotence. You feel like you can't make the art that you want to make, and there's no one supporting you.
I wonder, do you think that in some sense, that kind of fragmentation, that sort of splitting off into a kind of rugged, more desolate, more tribal, modern urban landscape, then calls back to the kind of fragmented tribalness and the sort of inhospitality. I'm going to use a different words. Just like the sort of rockiness of the land that the Greeks have more than the Romans.
Well, one thing that the Greeks definitely have over a lot of modern poets is that they had civic duties. So they, if you, and I mean, this is reflected in Ars Poetica also, but, if you were Sophocles or if you were Pindar, your poetry had to serve a function. You had to provide, if you were Sophocles, you had to provide this religious feeling for all of these people, and you had to provide entertainment for them, and you had to move them. And so that was determining, the kind of art you were making. And I was going to say, like, if you were Pindar, you are, I think you're writing these things to be sung, to be performed at these Olympic events, oftentimes. And so, there's very much a connection to the community that someone like Baudelaire never felt. Baudelaire had this idea of the dandy who was like antisocial, anti-society. And I think that part is very foreign to the Greeks.
But I mean, this is interesting because I think this brings us to something else, which is like you often talk about how sort of there has to be a kind of lucidity because Aeschylus and Pindar are writing for audiences, and you may have anticipated my question from my picking of those two poets in particular. But those two poets are renowned for being particularly let's use a sort of dirty bullshit, where they're known for being extremely difficult. So even they didn't quite prize a kind of public lucidity that is often, said and is required in public poetry that needs to sort of enthrall the masses.
Yeah, and I think that might have something to do with what Plato talks about in the Ion, of the poet being sort of a divine antenna or a conduit, where not everything has to make sense as long as it sounds cool. I think that's there's definitely some license there. And I think by that's also something to bring up, is religion. I think that the Greeks were more seriously religious than the Romans were a lot of times. I think that real Roman paganism was a thing. I don't think they were all just bullshitting it. I think that a lot of them really did believe in the gods and worshipped faithfully. But I do think that when you get to the Roman Empire, the urbanization and the concern for like Horace talks about we teach our kids arithmetic so that they'll know how to manage the estate. Like there's all these other secular concerns,
complaining about STEM programs. It's cool.
Right. Which override, I think, the religious attentions. I think that the fact that the Greeks were had a higher degree of religious passion than the Romans did. It had a lot to do with it.
Well, I will say, before I let Matthew and Alice take control, that I do think there's more mystery in Greek writing than there is in Roman writing. And I think that comes back in Baudelaire and Eliot. There's again a mystery, maybe not a religious mystery, more a sense of a kind of mystery and disillusionment, or kind of the mysteriousness of being disillusioned. While for the Greeks, it's more the mystery of the religion itself. Well, I think the Romans have less of this kind of mystery, at least for me.
Maybe so. I mean, I thought, well, I mean, I think there's I love Baudelaire and Eliot. To me, there does feel like there's a sort of a significant difference between, like a wild, primal, tribal music, laden poetry that is mysterious in that it sort of taps into a language that is still molten like lava, and is composed in the context of genuine, blood deep belief in the gods. Like there's a difference between that kind of mystery that is experienced communally and a mystery that mostly resides inside of one person's head and then is sort of marveled at by others from a distance. To me, those are sort of different tiers of mystery.
I don't disagree with that, but I will say, I mean, it's interesting you say tribal, because obviously Eliot once said that he would prefer if his poetry was read out to illiterate tribes. And whatever we want to make of this sort of weird racism.
What does that mean? To me, that's what are you talking about, Tom?
But I think there's something wonderfully true in that, because it
sounds good even if you don't understand it. That's true.
Well, that's the cynical way of saying it.
But how is that cynical? He wants it read out to illiterate tribes who don't. I mean, presumably you don't speak English. Are these English-speaking illiterate tribes?
I presume they're English-speaking. I don't think it's just that
like Angles and okay, all right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what he's trying to say is that he wants the shamanistic magic of the poetry to come across before sort of the high references and the Shakespeare references.
Yeah, and he said he wanted, with this plays, he wanted to achieve something like what he thought the Mass should do, which is like an intuitive, communal, symbolic experience where everybody sort of is in tune with all of the motions and the sounds and the movements at once. I don't know that's what you can honestly say is really happening in most of his poems, or if even in his plays. I mean, again, I love Eliot, but it often feels like there is this, there's just such a colossal difference between one guy's idea of what would be a cool collective symbolic experience and art that is sharpened and tested against actual collective experience, over centuries. Like it's just such an enormous difference. I had one more note about Horace before we go, but Alice, you were trying to say something a second ago. I wanted to let you jump in.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up, because I was going to say, do we get to hear these guys read their love poems to each other?
Oh yeah. I was just going to say, I had one more note about Horace, and then we can move on to their imitations if we want. But yeah, was that what you were going to ask?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, like, because I was thinking about, like, as you were complaining about him, Cameron, for being too conventional, and Elijah, you were complaining about him for being too conventional from a different angle, right? From being too conventional because those ideas were not particularly moving or informative or exciting. I was asking myself, like, well, okay, so why bother to read this? Like, why would one read this? What is the pleasure or the value there is to take from this theoretically? And I think I don't like this as much as I like the odes, but what I take from this is very similar to what I take from the odes, which is companionship. Like,
Yeah.
listening to this, to me, it's like it's a little bit like being in a room when some idiot young kid comes in and says that, like, my wife had a talk with a bunch of young precocious college students who were in the same scholarship program she was in, and one of them, like, asked a question, but in the process of asking the question said, like, well, I think I would just like to only write really, like, good important books when I grow up, when I'm publishing.
Yeah. No, that makes
And, like,
sense.
to me, this essay, like, in contrast to my wife's books, like, she was sort of like, well, did you ever consider writing something that was sort of, like, really good and serious and important? Because
God.
I sort of, I think I
What?
would prefer to do that when I publish my books.
Oh my God, how
and to me,
fucking
like, the
socially
pleasure of this
stupid.
essay is in part as if, like, rather than being the extremely disarming, sweet, decorous person Joanna was, if she had said, like, can we get another round? All right, let me tell you what I think about that. Like, I have some, and just went off on this girl for 10 minutes straight. Like, it would be the pleasure of listening to that. It's not that she has new advice about writing that I'm hearing for the first time. It's that it would be the pleasure of, like, amen. Let's, like say that part again. Like, did you hear that? It would be the pleasure, in a way, of the hype man saying, like, for fuck's sake, finally. And I think it is worth noting that in all this discussion of urbanity and classism, like, again, Horace's dad was a slave. And I think maybe not insignificantly, he then pulled himself up by his bootstraps. And then Horace, who then lost everything, again, was to some extent a self-made man by way of Maecenas' patronage, by way of Virgil's friendship. And those kind of, like, and people who have known poverty and then become very rich are often the most intolerant of the poor and of the working class later on. But this poem doesn't end in like, all right, young man, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, and then you'll be a poet, my son. It doesn't end like that at all. It ends in a moment of absolute disgust and despair that is honestly verging on incoherence. Whole
it barely makes any
page,
sense.
the whole last page is like, and here's another thing. You know what drives me fucking crazy? When poets are out there trying to kill themselves and then people try to help them. What a fucking idiot. Why would you help a poet? And I'm thinking, like, wait,
you should let them kill. You should let them die. He's a leech that won't let go until he's full of blood.
Right. Yeah. He says if you pull him out, there's no guarantee he's therefore going to be a sensible person and give up his wish to die a famous death. What made him become a poet anyway? Maybe he pissed on the ashes of his father or did something else unholy, someplace holy. Whatever it was, he's crazy. And like a bear who's broken out of his cage, he puts to flight everybody he meets by his horrible reading. If he catches a man, he'll read that man to death. He's a leech that won't let go till he's full of blood. End of epistle. Like, to me, that's like,
I truly thought there was a missing page when I got
He's just like, he just loses it in his frustration and disgust at the current state of poetry. And then he's like, all right, I'm done. I'm done with this advice. I can't keep doing this. I got to go open another cask of Caecuban wine and forget about this whole conversation. So to me, like, that's why I read it, is like the companionship of, like, somebody else who fucking gets it. Not that I agree with him on everything, not that he's exactly the kind of poet I would want to be, but that he's the voice that gets it. And to me, that was, again, that's what I found so appealing about him when I first came to him, was that he was somebody who was writing about death and loss and aging and humiliation in a way that felt like, oh God, I have company. I'm not alone in this. And it wasn't that he had new insights, because there aren't new insights to have about those things. It was just that it was so convincing, his voice as somebody living through this, in trying to look at it with clear eyes. Hey, it's just Matthew again. I I'm using my privilege as the editor, among other things, of this podcast to insert one more thought about the Ars Poetica. So while I was editing this episode, we talked a little bit about, we sort of speculated about some of what might have prompted it. The bratty Piso Jr. who seemed to be becoming a poet, and maybe his lack of appreciation for Horace as an artist in his own right. But something that occurred to me only while I was listening to this conversation in editing it was that at least a lot of the beginning, where Horace is sort of making these specific types of, sometimes slightly tortured arguments about why certain kinds of poetry might not work and things he would or wouldn't do. What occurred to me was that this might make a whole lot more sense contextually if it wasn't just that the younger Piso had, the dad had said, hey, he wants to be a poet, but if he had done what is way more common for young aspiring poets and actually sent Horace one of his poems. And in reading it, Horace said, oh my God, this is a piece of dog shit. How am I going to come up with an eloquent, entertaining way to explain why this is dog shit and not totally alienate this family? So I just had the thought that it may be that some of, especially the beginning of the Ars Poetica, might make slightly more sense in that context. Obviously, Horace knew people were going to read it who did not know, what letter the Pisos had sent them. But that was the thought I had. One other thing, just in editing the intro to this episode, I should say that Cameron and I do have, I think, an episode I am a little nervous about releasing on the main feed that is prompted by Marion Corbett's reflection on Timothy Murphy that is in New Verse Review. To clarify, Marion Corbett is a smart and good writer, and she is as smart and as good a writer as ever in this essay. We just disagree with her about some things. So that's where the contention comes from, not from any beef with Marianne herself. We just disagree and have some broader thoughts on the Tim Murphy reflection. But please do go read it, and then maybe you'll be even better prepared to get angry at Cameron and me when that episode comes out. Thank you for listening. And if you would like to hear the rest of, I think, the very entertaining other two parts of this conversation with Alice, Elijah, and Cameron, go to The Secret Show. Those are not Horace focused. They are, one is about being a failure as a writer, and one is a bizarre competition between Elijah and Cameron in which they imitate each other's poetry and we pass judgment on them. I think you will enjoy them. Go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and check it out. All right, that's all for this week. Sorry this took for fucking ever. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.